Chapter 3. We are on page 25. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact, several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from their star soul, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodella Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing you'd been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-etha sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel was quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-ethosensomatic and the scripts, he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largest electronic calculator. This had been about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of a million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated. This was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a largest bath towel from Marks and Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaguar Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Santraginus V, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars, which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakrafon. Use it as to sail a mini raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trawl, a mind-bogglingly stupid animal. It assumes if you can't see it can't see you. Daft as brush, but it's very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course you can dry yourself off with it if it seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense physiological value. For some reason, if a strag, meaning a non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that hitchhiker might have accidentally lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that has been passed into the hitchhiking slang as in, "Hey, you sass, that hoopy Ford Prefect." There's a Frood who really knows where his towel is. Sass, to be made aware of, etc. Happy, really together guy. Frood, really amazingly together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel and Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-ethosensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Jodella Bank, somebody decided it was time for somebody to have a relaxing cup of tea. "Got your towel with you?" said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked around at him. "Why? What? No. Should I have?" At any point had it given up being surprised, and there didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer and leaped to his feet. "What's that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Well, thank gosh for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. What? Shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. My gosh, they are! They're knocking my house down! What the heck am I going to do in the pub, Ford? It hardly makes any difference at this stage, said Ford. Let them have their fun. Fun? Yelped Arthur. Fun? He quickly checked out the window again. They were talking about the same thing. Well, dang, they're fun, he hooted and ran out of the pub furiously, waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub at lunchtime. Stop, you vandals, you homewreckers, bawled Arthur. You half-crazed Viscos, stop, will you? Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. There you are, sir, said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from that place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be farther than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far, so such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. Are you serious, sir? He said in a small whisper, which had the effect of silencing the pub. You think the world's going to end? Yes, said Ford, but this afternoon. Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippiest. Yes, he said gaily. In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate. The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had had either. Isn't there anything we can do about it then? He said. No, nothing, said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pocket. Somebody in the hush bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. I thought, he said, that if the world was going to end, we're meant to lay down or put a paper bag over our head or something. I mean, if you like, yes, said Ford. That's what they told us in the army, said the man, and his eyes began the long trek back to his whiskey. Will that help? Asked the barman. No, said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. Excuse me, he said. I gotta go. With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour. It would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge metal machines began to sink downward and move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become, and he didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. You barbarians, he yelled. I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I've got you hung, drawn, and quartered, and whipped and boiled until you've had enough. Ford was running after him very fast. Very, very fast. And then I will do it again, yelled Arthur, and when I've finished I will take all the little bits and I will jump on them. Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds, and possibly huge yellow somethings. And I will carry on jumping on them, yelled Arthur, still running, until I get blisters, or I can think of anything more unpleasant to do, and then... Arthur tripped, and fell headlong, rolled, and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His finger shot upward. What the heck is that? He shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monotonous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leaped off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. One after another one followed and did exactly the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense, running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, cities' streets exploded with people. Cars skidded into each other as the noise fell on them, and they rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flattening everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bugs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had known ever since his subetha-sensomatic had started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow and wakened him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in the small dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of course, all the races in all the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to planet Earth, he thought, didn't it have to be the Vogons? Still, he knew what he had to do. When the Vogon craft screamed through the high air above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and he threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them when he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky over every nation on Earth, motionless that hung huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still nothing happened. And there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the earth passed away, it was going to be treated to a very ultimate in sound. To the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. People of Earth, your attention, please. A voice said it was wonderful, wonderful, perfect quadraphonic sound with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. This is prosthetic Vogon Jelts of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council, the voice continued. As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system, and regrettably your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you. The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathering crowds as if they were iron fillings on a sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again, desperate fleeing panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again, and it said, "There's no point in acting at all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centuria for 50 of your Earth years, so you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted off across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky with easy power. On the underside of each, a hatchway opened, an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody had ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. It said, "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centuria? For heaven's sakes, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs. That's your own lookout." Energized demolition beams, light poured out of the hatchways. "I don't know," said a voice in the PA. "Apathetic planet, I've got no sympathy at all." It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. End of chapter 3.